again. It's the same time slot.
Well, there's also a lot of inauguration stuff happening, which may play a role.
Yeah, well, one of my friends from college actually just was running there's like a day of mental health awareness that was part of the inauguration. So he just posted online. It's really cool. Like he's working for like the inauguration. Cool. Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe hope next week things will calm down a little and multiple cheer attendance. All right. So on that note, I guess 7:05-ish, we can start. 7:04, 7:05. So we're up to this week, Parshat Bo.
We should all mute.
Yeah, good reminder to everybody to mute, and then only unmute when you want to participate or ask a question or whatever it is. And of course, everyone's always welcome to jump in, but until you jump in, please stay muted. So we get now to Parshat Bo. And just as a reminder, part of what we discussed so far in Shemot and Va'era was the point or themes of the book of Exodus, the second book in the Torah. Some of those themes we pointed out were tensions between Jewish identity and Egyptian identity, the point of being in Egypt, how we relate to exile. A lot of exile and redemption, Sefer HaGeulah, is a theme that runs throughout this. And that brings us to Parshat Bo, where now we're at the climax. We're at the end of the plagues, the latter half of the plagues, the Makat Bechorah, the plague of the firstborn, and eventually Paro's consent to let the Jewish people go. In the kindergarten song that I learned, it goes to remember the Parshat. It's Shemot Ve'era Bo, Paro let us go. So Paro let us go is like the main chap here. So that's a big deal. But while the main thrust of the Parsha focuses really on Paro letting us go, some of the Pesach descriptions, and some of the stuff that hopefully we'll learn together around Pesach time, what I want to really discuss and focus on is the first part of the Parsha, before Paro lets us go. We get to the crux of the negotiations. We get to the height of the drama between Moshe and Pharaoh, where they're discussing the release of the Jewish people. So I want to zoom in on that scene. On the end of the negotiations, I honestly picked a somewhat arbitrary plague. Any of the last 2 or 3 plagues really would have worked. But to just zoom in a little bit, and then to develop a little bit what exactly is going on here, to pose one big question, which I a little bit spoiled in the title, and to delve a little bit deeper into there. So we'll start now with Shemot Yud, Exodus chapter 10, from this week's Parsha. V'yomer Hashem Moshe, and Hashem said to Moshe, Bo el Paro, come to Pharaoh, ki ani hichbadati et libo ve'et lev avadav, leman shiti ototai ela b'kirbo. For I have hardened his heart and the heart of his courtiers, of his servants, in order that I may display my signs amongst them. So for those who read or heard the drasha last week, we talked a little bit about this in the drasha, this idea of God hardening Pharaoh's heart, how it's an essential part of the scene of what's going on, that God warns Moshe multiple times, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart, and multiple times the Torah reminds us, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And that has a whole fascinating theological discussion we touched on about free will, all of the implications. But what's clear from this pasuk is that at least here, God is saying the reason why he intends to do this. Why does God want to harden Pharaoh's heart? Why? Leman, in order, shitiat ototaya lebekirbo, that my signs, my various plagues or signs or acts of divine intervention will be seen, will be made public through Pharaoh. So the Rishonim and the commentaries, as we touched on in the drasha, have all these different theories as to why God hardened Pharaoh's heart. But one thing that's definitely true is that God himself says in the pasuk that one of the goals of prolonging this process of hardening Pharaoh's heart is providing the opportunity for the 10 plagues, providing the opportunity for God to make a spectacle of it. And just as a bit of a side point, we didn't go into this so much, but one of the themes that actually comes up a lot at the Seder is this idea that Pesach, or the Exodus, wasn't just a moment in Jewish history, but is a moment in global history. That God is doing this for a global audience, for the nations of the world, for the Egyptians to see, etc., etc. And we see a little bit of that mentioned here. That part of the goal, part of what's going on here, is the show, the production of God bringing his signs and his punishment onto Pharaoh. All right, so far so good. That's why we understand this is a little bit of a refrain that comes up after most of the plagues, and it gives us this insight into why we have this long, prolonged negotiation. God is giving Pharaoh the opportunity to set himself up for more miracles, more signs, more statements of God's divinity. All right, pasuk bet. Ulman tisaper baznei bincha uben bincha et asher hitalalti b'Mitzrayim ve'et ototai asher samti vam v'yadatem ki ani Hashem. And so you may recount to the hearing of your sons and your sons' sons how I made a mockery of Egypt. I displayed my signs among them in order that you may know that I am the Lord. So there's 2 goals here. One is, or maybe not 2 goals, maybe one goal with an explanation. God says, I want to bring all of my signs. Why? So that you can tell it over for generations. An interesting thing to note here is that here in this pasuk, God says the audience is the Jewish people, presumably. Bo'znei vincha, speaking to Moshe to tell to the Jewish people that your sons, your children, should be able to recount over the great deed of the Exodus that God did for you. That they should recount the signs, the otot that God brought. So it's just interesting to think about whenever we're dealing with some sort of performance or God installing in Moshe some charge of performing, saying, demonstrating, who's the intended audience? So on the one hand, we can understand how like some of the Meforshim, some of the commentaries develop that the global stage is the audience. This is setting up the national story, the Jewish burst onto the scene, the reprimand of Egypt for being so harsh with its slavery, however you want to view the global message. But we can also understand less than global message, more narrowly, that this is also setting up a Jewish message. That without these miracles, it limits a little bit what we're able to do at the Seder, at the Pesach celebration, as part of our tradition. And of course, this tradition, to an extent, is also carried on at the Seder, because if we remember, at the Seder, what's one of the Mishnayot that we quote? We multiply the miracles. Every makkah, every plague God did at the Yom Sov was actually 10, was actually 100, was actually however many, because the rabbis also have this goal of making it a bigger demonstration. There's some sort of statement that's being made by the miracles, by the Nisim. God doesn't just subvert nature for no reason. So if there's some sort of dramatic statement being brought by these 10 plagues, like God says, so that you and your children should know them. So we sort of get the rabbinic urge, the general traditional urge, to play up the plagues as much as possible. The whole idea is that the more plagues, the bigger the spectacle, the bigger of a statement of God's divinity, and the bigger of a takeaway we're going to have for the future generation. So just interesting to think about that while Moshe and Pharaoh are negotiating for the Jewish people's freedom, God pulls Moshe aside and makes like a pedagogical statement. By the way, I'm going to prolong this so that the future Jews of the world, so that your children and grandchildren will have what to talk about. Okay, so that's the backdrop through which this happens. So now all of that was Moshe's command. Moshe's commanded to go to Pharaoh to demand freedom. Pharaoh will reject it, and this is all part of the bigger plan of bringing God's signs to the world. This brings us to Pasuk Gimel, Vayavo Moshe v'Aarona Paro. Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh. V'yamru elav, and they say to him, Ko amar Hashem Elokei Avrim, so says Hashem, the God of the Hebrews, Ad matai me'anta la'anot mipanai, until when are you going to refuse to humble yourself before me? Interesting language. I refuse to humble yourself. I don't know. It's a very strange formulation. Me'anta, you prohibited or prevented yourself, le'anot, to be humble. Shalach ami v'ya'avduni. Send my nation, and they will serve me. Ki im me'enata l'shaleach et ami, for if you refuse to send my nation, hinani mevi machar arbe b'gvulecha. I will bring locust in your boundaries. So Moshe goes to Paro and he says, Shalach et ami v'yavduni, send out my nation so that they may serve me. And if you don't, I'll bring arbe, I'll bring locust. And then here we have, okay, so from there, sorry, I lost my spot. We have here, Pasuk Hey, verse 5. V'chisa et in haaretz. The locusts will be so numerous, they'll block out the sky, they'll block out the sun, you won't be able to see. The lo yuchal lerot et haaretz, you won't be able to see the land. V'achal et yeter ha'pleita hanisheret lechem min ha'barad. They'll eat what's left over from the barad. Just as a side note, there's like an interesting way in which the Makot are very linearly being described as progressive. They progress on each other. The barad destroys the produce, and then it's finished off by the arbe. The arbe blots out the sky, and it's darkened by the choshech. That there's a little bit of like almost like a sneak peek of the coming Makkah, because there's some sense of thematic buildup that's going on over them. And one of the interesting things that is open to interpretation is, what is the thematic buildup? Is it an attack on Egyptian culture, attack on Egyptian religion? There's all different explanations, but what's clear is that the Makkah, the plagues, are very clearly interrelated. They're intertextual, they have a lot to do with each other, and they reference each other. So we see this interesting idea that even in Arbe, even in Locust, we have reference of the darkness of blotting out the sky, and we have a reference to the economic or the agricultural destruction of Barad, of the hail. So just something interesting to keep in mind. So we now get to Arbe, we get to Locust, and it's going to destroy everything and blot out the sky. They'll fill your house and your servant's house. And the household of all of Egypt. Asher lo ra'u avatecha, which your forefathers have never seen, the avot avotecha, and your grandfathers' fathers have never seen, from the day you were born until today, and dramatically, after threatening Pharaoh, Moshe walks out. So we have the threat. So I think section 1 we see is God's commandment to Moshe. Section 2, Moshe follows, Moshe delivers, and he relays to Pharaoh in perhaps greater detail, but the threat of what's about to come. V'yomru avdei Pharaoh elav. Now this is very interesting. All of a sudden now we shift, and we get the perspective of the avdei Pharaoh, of Pharaoh's servants. Very strange. So why do we care what Pharaoh's servants have to say? We have here, very clearly, dueling deities. Pharaoh, the god king of Egypt, versus Yud-Keh Vav-Keh, the god of the Jewish people. They're arguing and fighting over who owns the Jewish people, and Pharaoh's servants get an opinion? What's going on here? I don't know. To me, this strikes me as very strange. It's one of the first times we have in the narrative this reference or integration, this heavy reliance on what the servants, of what the Avadim think. And now we have this little interlocution here. V'imru avdei Pharaoh elav. Pharaoh's servant said to him, Ad matai yezeh lanu l'mokesh. How much longer will this be for us a burden, punishment, suffering? Shalach et anashim, send out these men. V'yavdu et Hashem Elokechem, let them serve Hashem their God. Haterem teda ki avda Mitzrayim. Before you know it, before it is known that Egypt is lost. Are you not aware? Do you not know that Egypt is lost? In other words, this is a lost cause. A lost cause. Do you, Pharaoh, not know it's a lost cause? I think this is shocking. I didn't know that people could talk to Pharaoh that way. So first of all, you have servants telling Pharaoh this is a lost cause. What's going on there? And then beyond that, why is it important to even mention this? What's the Torah trying to tell us here? That Pharaoh runs his policy by his servants? Not even his citizens, by the way, but rather they're avdei Pharaoh. Eved is the same term that's used to refer to the Jewish people. These are his slaves, his servants, the lowest of the low in society. It's very surprising to see them getting a seat at the table, them speaking up. I'll just also point out, because one of the things we love to do is focus on the translation. Very interesting, and I think there's a lot of valence to the translation that Sepharia chooses, or whatever source Sepharia uses for translation, that understands avdei Paro in verse 7 to be Pharaoh's courtiers. I think courtier sounds very regal. Pharaoh went to his courtiers and got advice and counsel. But I think if that was translated as slaves, like everybody translates it when we refer to the Jews as avadim, it'd be a totally different picture. So just something interesting to note, it doesn't say a different word. Avadim still means slaves, but nonetheless, all of a sudden now we have the courtiers and not the slaves of Pharaoh. But we got this appeal to outside advice, outside support. Pharaoh asks, what do my people think? Or maybe he doesn't. We don't even see him ask. They weigh in on their own. All right, so that takes us now to verse 8. Yushavet Moshe vet Aaron el Paro. So Moshe and Aaron went back to Paro. V'yomru alehem l'chu ivdu et Hashem Elokechem mi umi hahochem. And he said to them, Paro says to Moshe, go worship the Lord your God. Who is going? In other words, what's going on here? I want to fill this in. I want to clarify. I don't understand. What's going on here? Moshe and Aaron go back to Paro, and Paro says, well, who's going to go? Isn't everybody going to go? Isn't it obvious the whole nation is going to go free? What's it mean, umi ha'ochem? Who's going to come? Moshe's answer seems obvious. Moshe says, our young and our old. Our sons and our daughters. Our sheep and our cattle. It'll be a holiday, it'll be a celebration to God. So Pharaoh goes and says, he relents. We have this weird scene where avdei Pharaoh say, this is too much. Pharaoh relents and says, all right, you can go. And he says, but who are you going to take? And Moshe says, obviously, everybody, young, old, man, woman, child, we're taking everybody. What's going on here? Why does Pharaoh not know that? Why does Moshe have to explicate it? And then, and so in Pasuk 10 now, we have Pharaoh respond, where he says, Hashem, or Yud-Keh Vav-Keh imachem, which is sort of interesting to see come out of his mouth. Hashem imachem, just like I'll send you and your babies, Re'u ki ra'a neged penechem. Clearly, you are bent on doing evil. In other words, you're asking for the babies to go? The babies are going to go celebrate the holiday to God? Clearly, you're just asking for wholesale evil, for something bad, when you even ask for your babies to go. Again, seems strange. What, Pharaoh thought that they were going to leave the babies in Egypt? I'm very strange. And this section ends, Lochen. Pharaoh rescinds his offer, changes his mind. Nope. You're not going to go in the end. Lechu nahagvarim v'ivdu et Hashem ki ota atem mevakshim. V'yigresh otam et penei Paro. Paro says, no, your men can go because that's what you want, and Paro kicked them out. So Paro says only the men can go for the Chag of Hashem. So what in the world is going on here? We have such a strange section. Just to highlight a few of the weird things that we pointed out, we have all of a sudden Pharaoh's servants being a prominent part of this discussion, complaining that the Jews are making it bad for all of Egypt. We have Pharaoh relenting and telling Moshe, well, who do you want? What do you mean, who do you want? Everybody. We have Moshe saying everybody, and Pharaoh saying, well, not the babies. What do you mean, not the babies? And then all that concludes with Pharaoh saying, well, since he said everybody, even the babies, clearly you're dishonest, you're not allowed to go. A very strange section. Anyone have any ideas what's going on here? What's this communication between Pharaoh and Moshe? What are they arguing or negotiating or talking about? I'm going to open it to the floor for any ideas, questions, participation right now. Give him a few seconds. No pressure, though.
Well, you know, Pharaoh turned us, the Israelites, into slaves. Okay, and we did the work. And now yet, I think he's becoming a slave to his own arrogance, because I don't think it's going to show here. I think it shows more as we get toward the end, because he can't let go. So now who's the slave?
So I think that's a great point. I think that's actually Davka, something we're going to touch on soon. The part of what's going on here is really highlighting arrogance.
He's listening to those who are standing around him, because now they've had enough. And they finally maybe got enough courage to say to him, all right, already, this is enough, because you see, they could no longer create it. It was no longer magic. It was magic when their magicians could do exactly the same thing that Moses and Aaron did. Suddenly they can't.
Interesting.
They recognize, this is not magic. Before it was.
That's very, very interesting. So Lindy's...
They did it. I mean, it's nuts what they did. But they did it. They brought the frogs, and so they made more. And they brought this, and so they made more. And then they got the lice. So... Yeah,
I think that's a great point. Lindy's pointing out that part of what this does is push us to consider, how is this being received? How are the Egyptians thinking about this? I think that's a really good point. But I think that what even with your beginnings of an approach, I think what's still a little bit confusing is exactly what's going on with this negotiation here. Yeah, Paul, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I think Paro is getting to the etzem that he understands that if they're taking their Tzon and Bakar and their Tapim and all those other people, that they're out of there.
Ah, perfect. Exactly. Paul is hitting exactly the nail on the head. That what's going on here has to be understood in the broader context of this negotiation that's ongoing. Because up until this point, Moshe actually has not explicitly said that they're not coming back. Moshe's never told Pharaoh we're leaving and we're not coming back. So exactly like Paul's saying, it's only now when Moshe says everybody, everything is going, Pharaoh's like, well, obviously you're not coming back then. But just to drive this home, to really clarify, when we go and we look to one of the first times Moshe approaches Pharaoh, the first approach, in source 2, we have about Achar Bo Moshe Aaron. After all these great events, the burning bush, Moshe and Aaron go and they approach Pharaoh. V'yomru Paro, and they say to Pharaoh, Kol Amar Hashem Elokei Yisrael, so says Hashem, the God of Israel, Shalach et ami, v'yachogu li bamidbar. Send my nation to celebrate a holiday in the desert. V'yomer Paro, mi Hashem asher shema b'kolo. And then Paro says, who's this good Vavke you're talking about? That I should listen, the Shaleach et Yisrael, to send the Israelites out. Lo yadati et Hashem kam Yisrael l'Shaleach. Never heard of him, not to. And then Moshe responds, the God of the Hebrews, let us go on a 3-day journey in the desert, and we'll go and offer sacrifices to Hashem our God. Lest he strike us with pestilence or the sword. In other words, very clearly, in the first time that Moshe meets Pharaoh, what he says his ask is, what the plan for the Jewish people, what the negotiation is about, is a 3-day holiday to celebrate God. Moshe goes to Pharaoh and he says, listen, you're a religious leader, you understand religion. It's a big deal to go a long time without offering to your God. We're afraid he's going to strike us. B'dever o b'cherev, a little bit ironic knowing what's about to come later on in the story. Moshe says the Jewish people are afraid of dever. They're afraid of military, of swords, of being killed, like God will soon do to the Egyptians. So let us go out and offer sacrifices to our God to placate him for 3 days. In other words, Moshe sells this request as temporary, as a 3-day holiday to recharge the Jewish people's religious spirits, but not a full emancipation. And it's not Moshe's invention. This was actually God's plan all along. And perhaps even more troubling, it wasn't just God's plan to ask for a 3-day holiday. It's explicit in the scene of the sneh, the scene of the burning bush, that it was God's plan specifically to deceive, to mean one thing and to say another. So if we go to Parak Gimel, to chapter 3, we have the scene of the sneh, the scene of the burning bush, where Moshe is given his charge and told what to say to Pharaoh. And here the Torah tells us in source 3, Vayomer od Elohim Moshe, God says further to Moses, Ko tomaro b'nei Israel, thus you should say to the Israelites, Hashem Elokei Avotechem Elokei Avram Elokei Yitzchak Elokei Yaakov Shalchan Aleichem. God, the God of Abraham and Isaac, sent me to you. Zeshmi L'olam Zechri L'dor, this is my name. Lech v'asafta ziknei Israel. Gather the Jews. V'amarta Aleichem. Say to them, Hashem Elokei Avotechem nira elai. Hashem, the God of your forefathers, appeared to me. Okay, Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Lemor, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, Hakod pekadati etzchem, I've remembered you, and that which I have done, that which has happened to you in Egypt. The Omar ele etchem einei Mitzrayim el eretz Kanani, and eyes will say, I will now take you out of Egypt to the land of the Kanani, the Chiti, the Amori, the Prizi, the Chivi, the Vusi, the land of milk and honey. What does God promise Moshe? What does God tell Moshe to tell the Jews? Moshe, tell the Jews the time has come to go to Israel and fulfill the promise of Abraham. But what is Moshe supposed to tell Pharaoh? Now go to the king of Egypt and tell him, tell him the God of Israel is manifest himself to us. Let us go a 3-day journey in the desert. And we'll go sacrifice to Hashem our God. So Moshe is told, tell the Jewish people, the ultimate reckoning is now, the eternal promise to the forefathers is about to be fulfilled, and you're about to take over Israel. And tell Pharaoh, you need a 3-day holiday in the desert. It's clear. God specifically told Moshe to say one thing to Pharaoh and one thing to the Jewish people. It seems that God is advising Moshe that the best way to achieve freedom for the Jewish people, the best way to negotiate with Egypt, is through dishonesty, through lying. Tell Pharaoh you want 3 days, and then just never come back. Just trick him. And that's shocking. God is telling Moshe, God, who is God, the infallible, is telling Moshe, who is Moshe Rabbeinu, you should lie and trick with Pharaoh, and then we'll just run away and never come back. First of all, it's shocking because of the ethical implications of it. And even if you want to say, well, they're enslaved, it's fine to lie to save someone from slavery. Seems right. But why does God need to do that? He's God. God doesn't need to lie to trick Pharaoh. What's going on here? Why is God lying and tricking? Why isn't it merely enough for God to go and take the Jews out miraculously? End of the day. Why is this lie so important? And we see this lie gets repeated over and over again. Every time Moshe appears to Pharaoh, the pretense, as we just saw, is that the Jews are going to leave for 3 days. So much so that when it comes to locusts, Pharaoh's first ascent, when Pharaoh first says, you know what, fine, I'll actually let them go, the negotiation is over who's going to go, not how long. It's only for 3 days. That's already agreed upon. So we see this surprising deception by Moshe as advised by God in the negotiation between Moshe and Pharaoh. And what's interesting is that this deception is not unique, but rather it really punctuates and colors the entire experience of Exodus, of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Because, for example, later on in our Parsha, in Shemot Yud Bet in Exodus 12, we have the Jewish people, Uvnei Yisrael asu kedvar Moshe, the Jewish people do as Moses says in source 4 here, and they asked to borrow from the Egyptians gold and silver vessels and clothing. Very, very careful language here. The Yisha'alu, they asked to borrow, implying they're going to come back and return it. And God disposed the Egyptians favorably toward the people, whatever that meant. Maybe he made them so afraid of the Israelites that they're going to do whatever they want. So they listened to their request, and they gave the Jews all their stuff. In other words, when the Jews are about to leave Egypt, what do? They turn to their masters, they turn to the Egyptians, and they don't say, you owe us wages. They don't say, give us money. They say, oh, we're going on this 3-day festival, and what do you know? I don't have a golden bowl. You think I could borrow your golden bowl for a few days?
Sure.
Then just lie and steal. I mean, I don't want to overstate it, but that seems to be the implication. The Jews are asking to return things, knowing they're never coming back. They're already told they're going to Israel to settle the land of Israel. And in fact, when we look earlier, we see that this is exactly what Moshe is supposed to be telling the people. This is the plan all along. Daber na baznei ha'am, speak in the ears of the nation. V'yisha'alu ish me'et re'ehu. God tells Moshe that each person should ask to borrow. V'yisha'alu. They shouldn't ask to receive, but to borrow. V'isha me'et ruta, and each woman from her female compatriot, klei chesed v'klei zahav, silver and gold. God is telling Moshe to lie, to deceive. And once again, this is already latent in the burning bush. Because when we go all the way back to Parak Gimel, to the blueprint, to the game plan for all that's about to follow, we see in Parak Gimel, God says, I'll make this nation favorable in the eyes of the Egyptians. So that when they go, they won't go out empty-handed. Each woman will borrow from her neighbor and her lodger silver, gold, and clothing. And you'll put them on your children and save them, strip them from the Egyptians. They'll ask to borrow, but you will strip them from the Egyptians. Again, this clear plan, this clear plot of dishonesty. And this,
Rabbi,
yeah, please.
isn't this also a promise that is being kept to Abraham?
Great point. This is a promise being kept to Abraham, because Abraham's promise his kids will leave with much wealth and much gold. But again, once again, we fall into that same situation where if God thought it was time to fulfill Abraham's promise, why do you have to be deceptive about it? He could just take the Jews out of Egypt. He could just give them money. Why does he have to tell the Jews, tell Moshe, to lie, to say, I'm going to borrow it and give it back to you, but then never give it back to them? So that's the question at the heart of our shir today. Why did God lie? Why is there deception at the heart of the Yetziat Mitzrayim story? And unsurprisingly, of course, we're not the first ones to ask this question, but rather the question is well sourced in the tradition. So, for example, the Akedat Yitzchak of Isaac Arama, an important late medieval, early modern, I guess one could argue, early modern commentary in, I want to say Italy, but I have to look into exactly where the Akedat Yitzchak is from. But the Akedat Yitzchak asks exactly this question, much like the Abarbanel, who we've joked about before. The Akedat Yitzchak style is that he lists a whole bunch of questions, and then he answers them all systematically. So, question number 9 of the Akedat Yitzchak for our Parsha, Tet here, question 9. Regarding the mission that God gave Moshe, that he should tell Pharaoh that we want 3 days to celebrate a holiday. How is that honorable to God to sneakily lie and sneak them out? Shouldn't he have just been upfront from the beginning until the end, that Biyad Ramah, with a raised hand in the open, God is going to save and take his people out? Why? How is it honorable? How does it help God to lie and be deceptive? V'kasha od mizeh, and v'kasha od, and further question, mizeh umro v'she'ela isha mishkanta megaret beitzah klei chesed v'klei zahav. Because also here the Torah tells us that the women were supposed to ask to borrow various possessions that they intended to steal. The embarrassment, the shame of the Jewish people lying and stealing is public. Whatever that word is. But we know the point. So since when are you told explicitly out in the open? Since when do you teach people? Go steal, go deceive people. And to make matters worse, it's not like this is about to happen right now. This is Shmo Parak Gimel. This is the burning bush. This isn't going to happen for 9 more prakim. God is premeditating his deception. He's telling Moshe 10 chapters early, this is the ruse we're going to pull later on in the game. How is that Kavod Hashem, Kavod Malchus? How does that make God and the Jewish people look good? The whole thing is unexplainable, very difficult. That's the question of the Yad Ramah, not the Yad Ramah, sorry, that's the question of the Akedat Yitzchak of Isaac Arama. It's repeated by a bunch of 15th and 16th century commentaries, and also interestingly is brought up by the Ran, Rabbeinu Nisim, in his Drashot, in his theological or philosophical reflections. He has a book called Drashot Haran, the expositions or sermons of the Ran. It's a few hundred pages, despite only being like 12 or 15 Drashot. They're very long. But one of them, he addresses this very question too. In passing, he points out, hey, Isn't it sort of weird that God and Moses lied? What's up with that? So we have the question of the Ran in his Drashot, or of the Kedat Yitzchak of Rabbi Zakarama. It's also famously quoted by Nechama Leibovitz, quotes it in her book. She quotes the Kedat Yitzchak. I'm not so holding in Rabbi Zakarama that I would just know it off the top of my head. But I'm sure at one point in history I learned it in Nechama Leibovitz, so that's how that stuck. But so that's our question for today. Why did God lie? So there's one genre which I guess is best termed just straight up apologetic. And the goal there isn't even to try and come to some sort of understanding of why this would happen, but just to defend that this didn't happen. So one approach taken by Mefarshim in my commentaries is just trying to preserve, like we saw the Kedat Yitzchak say, Kavod Hashem, God's honor. And to that extent, the most important thing is just to demonstrate God didn't lie. So perhaps one of the best examples of this is the Ktav HaKabbalah. I'll admit that I didn't do the research sufficiently to know who the Ktav HaKabbalah is, but from my own learning experience, I can share. The Ktav HaKabbalah is it's got to be 18th or 19th century, I'm not sure, a relatively recent commentary on the Torah, whose goal is to show the logic or the internal reasoning behind every drasha or every rabbinic statement based in the language and the sourcing of the verses itself. Hence the name Haktav HaKabbalah, the written and the received, because it's about bridging the gap between the written tradition, the verses of the Bible, and the received tradition, which is the drashot, or the expositions the rabbis learn on them. So he tries to do grammatical studies, all these very interesting stuff to explain logically how drashot, how rabbinic exposition naturally flows from psukim. Problem was, he was some Haredi rabbi with very poor grammatical and linguistic training, so his grammar is almost always wrong. So this is an example of that. So the Ktav HaKabbalah says, oh, did God lie? No. Why? Milat shalach, this conjugation of the word shalach, to send, hu min hakaved, is in the strong form, the PL form. Ki hashin petucha v'halamed digusha. Because there's no dagesh, there's no emphasis added on the shin, but there is an emphasis added on the daled. He's making a grammatical point that isn't always true. We don't have to get into the grammar here. The havdel bin hakaved v'akalhu, and the difference between heavy or a strong conjugation and the lighter conjugation of a verb, and with regards to the word shalach, with regard to the words to send, shlichut bekal yore al shlichut bilti muchletet ki'im lechazara, because when you send something away lightly, you send it away indecisively. You leave open the possibility, the option of return. But sending something away strongly, definitively, means sending away with no option of return. So it says the Ktav HaKabbalah, the specific grammatical conjugation of the word send my nation away that Moses uses actually implies an indefinite sending. So since it implies an indefinite sending, even if he says derech shloshet yamim, 3 days journey, well, he's already made it clear he doesn't plan to come back. So technically God didn't lie. That's what the Ktav HaKabbalah says. Moshe really was telling Pharaoh that he was never returning, and that's implied by the language. So just one problem is, why did Moshe even bother saying derech shloshet yamim, a 3 days journey? Minimally, it still seems dishonest. Like, it still seems like an aha gotcha moment. Like, technically I didn't lie, but like obviously he's deceiving Pharaoh. Otherwise he wouldn't mention it's only 3 days away. He's trying to say, oh, it's so close. We're just going 3 days away. We'll be back in a minute. But even beyond that, it happens to be that the Ktav HaKabbalah is just wrong grammatically. And I've asked a bunch of people about in Hebrew, and it's just not true. The PL, the emphatic form of the verb to send, does not imply not sending back. That has nothing to do with it. There's other things it implies. There is a real grammatic difference in conjugation between the kaved and the kal, the PL and the pual, the strong and the weak. But none of it has to do with whether or not you're going to come back. So the Ktav HaKabbalah's answer is totally wrong, grammatically wrong, still difficult in the text. But what we see is one genre, of which this is perhaps the most extreme and maybe even worst example, but the most extreme example of a pure apologetic. God didn't lie, Moses didn't lie, you're misunderstanding the Pasuk. So that's step one. I think perhaps a slight modification of that is put forth with Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra does want to preserve to some extent the idea that God didn't just straight up lie. So he does try some amount of apologetic, but he also at least tries to explain why it's necessary. It's not like the Ktav HaKabbalah where the goal is just to show God is honest, but rather he's trying to depict the larger scene and why this is a necessary component of it, but still it's important that God didn't straight up lie because God's God. So when he tells Moses what to do, he can't lie. I mean, it's God. So Ibn Ezra says, V'dah, you should know, Ki Moshe Adaninu lo amar lefaro sheyashuvu ad sheyichsav. Moshe never really explicitly said he's going to come back after they leave. It's not like he really lied. Rak amar sheyichaku derech shlosha yamim. He just said, let us distance ourselves a 3-day journey. If, the right conditions, Israel's a 3-day journey away from Egypt. They're going to distance themselves 3 days and just never come back. And that's what Moshe said. So he didn't technically lie. Of course, again, to anyone with modern sensibilities, this is as close to a lie as one could get. So I don't know if the technical difference means that much. Maybe if Moshe was on trial, he wouldn't perjure himself here or something. But okay, Moshe technically didn't lie. So V'dat HaMitzrim Haita, the Egyptian understanding was Sheyashuvu, that the Jews will return Al Kain Hashilum, and that's why they lent them the vessels of gold, silver, clothing, etc. Uba'avor davar acher she'ilu natan lehem paru lechet v'lo yashuvu lo haya rodef achareihem. And God did this for a different reason, for an alternative motivation, that if the Egyptians knew definitively that the Jews were granted full emancipation, full legal freedom, they would never have bothered to chase them when the Jews tried to leave through the Yam Suf, Derech Yam Suf. They would just say, okay, fine, they're free. Like, we have no right to chase after them. But it's only because they think the Jews are returning that when Pharaoh says, oh my gosh, it was a lie all along, they're not coming back, the Egyptians say, okay, fine, let's go chase after them now. They lied to us. So in other words, says the Ibn Ezra, why is it that God has to lie or deceive a little bit? He minimizes it. God and Moses minimize as much as possible. They tell a technical truth, but they mislead because God has a greater goal, the complete dismantling of the Egyptian army. And the only way to do that is to provoke Egypt into a military conflict at the Dead Sea and then to kill them all. So to do that, God had to ensure that the Egyptians would be willing to pursue the Jews. For the Egyptians to be willing to pursue the Jews, they had to think there was some shot, there was some chance. So God had to deceive Egypt and say the Jews might actually still return. So what is left as a little bit of an open question, what's not answered, is why God thought it was valuable to kill the Egyptian army. But I don't think that's so hard. I mean, Egypt doesn't seem like good guys. It makes a lot of sense that God would have various motivations to either punish them, to dismantle them so they can't do this to other nations, whatever it might be. But for whatever reason, God has clear, strong motivation to rain down a miraculous punishment and wipe out Egypt's army in one foul swoop of the Yam Suf. But the only way to do that is through a little bit of deception. Get the Egyptians invested. So therefore, says the Ibn Ezra, based off of that, we see why it's legitimate, why it's justified that God and Moses were a little deceptive. And in fact, when we look at the Psukim, this isn't so far off, because the Psukim honestly tell us that God was a little bit deceptive to kill the Egyptian army. The Torah tells us, in source 10 here, Daber b'nei Israel, God tells Moshe, tell the Jewish people, in Parshat Bashalach, V'yashuvu v'yachnu l'fnei piachirot, turn around and stop traveling and just camp in this area of Piachirot, bein Migdal v'nei between Migdal and the sea, l'fnei Baal Tzafon, nechachtaknu yam, v'amar Paro l'bnei Israel, and Paro says to the Jewish people, Nivuchem mehem ba'aretz, sagar alehem hamidbar. The Jews are lost, they must be trapped. V'chazakti alei Paro v'redaf achreihem. And then I will strengthen Paro to take advantage of them and chase after you. In other words, what does God tell Moshe to do? Pretend you're confused and lost, so Pharaoh will chase after you. Deceive Pharaoh, so the army will end up by the sea and I can kill them. God says it pretty explicitly. That's the only reason they go this roundabout route. Yeah, Paul.
But it says in the Haggadah that when the angels are rejoicing at the destruction of the Egyptians at Yam Suf, that Hashem tells them not to celebrate. These are my children that are being killed.
That's a really good point. So it's a very tough balance here, right? Because on the one hand, the rabbis make it very clear, and I think we all want this to be the case, that the Jewish perspective is that every life, even Egyptian military lives, are valuable, and it's tragic that they're lost. But at the same time, God is clearly orchestrating and pulling strings for the sake of this mass attack on the Egyptian army. So actually, I think that's like a very powerful message, that even the people who we have legitimate reason in being afraid of, hating, who have mistreated us, there's still some recognition of the tragedy of the loss of their life, because it's still a loss of human life, and that's inherently a tragedy, which is a beautiful point to make here. It's just emphasized when we look at the Psukim, and we see that it's really God himself who's planning this large attack on the Egyptian army. But yeah, thank you. It's a good Torah also for Pesach. So hopefully we can remember that when we get up to it in our Seders. So, shkach. But so what we see here is that despite God's value of human life, he's operating this large-scale scheme to get all of the Egyptian army killed. And that's the explanation, that's the motivation according to the Ibn Ezra. So I think Paul is touching upon, and something that I think we all feel a little disturbed by, is really, like, that was God's play? The whole point was to kill a bunch of soldiers? We know the Midrash says Pharaoh himself didn't even die. So you can argue, is that historical? Is it just sort of making some sort of point? But really, if God had a large-scale plan to punish Egypt by the Yam Suf, he's not going to punish the guy who is like most responsible. It's a little bit surprising. It's a little bit confusing. And in fact, the Abarbanel, he quotes this explanation of the Ibn Ezra, and he just flat out rejects it. Says it's not true, it's not right, doesn't make sense with the psukim. There's no way all this was just to wipe out the Egyptians at the sea. God could have done that without lying if he wanted to. So says the Abarbanel as follows. Yoter nachon etzli, more correct in my opinion, lefi she'asa HaKadosh Baruch Hu kein k'dei laharot lebnei adam chozek leiv paro. Fascinating approach by the Abarbanel. The Abarbanel says, why is it that Moshe opened up by asking for 3 days of freedom? Why wasn't it that Moshe didn't just ask to let the Jewish people go? God was trying to demonstrate just how hard-headed Pharaoh was. It wasn't dishonest. It's not that Moses lied and said, give us 3 days, thinking the whole time, oh, we want to leave forever. Moses asked for 3 days as a negotiation tactic. He'll go from there. But he wanted to show everybody that even just leaving for 3 days, even the most minimal ask, Pharaoh's going to say no to because of how stubborn he is. In other words, says the Abarbanel, God is making a public case for the Jewish people. It's not that, oh, well, they have to pay their dues as immigrants. It's that they're being abused. They're being mistreated. They have a religion that they're not even being able to practice. They ask for the bare minimum. Give us 3 days to sacrifice to our God because we fear divine retribution. And Pharaoh says no. What a great case to make to the world, to make to the global stage. Our God, Yud-Keh Vav-Keh, is not randomly mean, randomly vindictive. He's not just going to wipe out other nations for no reason, but rather what we have here is an unusually cruel situation, even for the ancient world, even for a world of slavery, denying us the right to do our own sacrifices, to practice our own religion, necessitates total freedom, necessitates total emancipation, according to the Abarbanel. So what we have here is true, some amount of dishonesty, but it's not dishonesty because Moses thought he was going to trick Pharaoh, but it's to make a statement. He's making a statement on the global stage that Pharaoh is a hard-headed, cruel ruler. I think that's a very powerful idea. In two senses. One, that God is orchestrating these events to make a statement to the world, like we saw before. There's the emphasis on ototai, my signs, my symbols, the things God is putting out into the world by performing the Exodus. That's part of the point. That's part of what we're trying to accomplish. But more than just the symbol to the world, the fact that the world is part of the audience here, what's also very interesting is the idea that it's a legitimization, or a case needs to be made for the Jewish people going out. Because if you're really going to form a Jewish nation, you're going to form your own country, you need to make sure that the origin story here is above reproach. It can't be that you are a bunch of thugs who overran Pharaoh. Everybody for all of the history has to look back at the story, and they have to see as clear as day that Pharaoh was an oppressor who needed to be out-toppled. So I think that's a very powerful understanding and reading of the story, and it might even tie a little bit in to, as we saw, this huge emphasis on ototai, on the production of all of it, on God extending and drawing this out to make a statement. But I want to conclude with one similar but slightly different approach put forth by the Kedah Yitzchak, by the Rabbi Isaac Arama, who we quoted all the way before, as asking a question that framed our shir. The Kedah Yitzchak, Rabbi Isaac Arama, in response to his own question, in response to this question of how could God and Moses lie and deceive Pharaoh, he gives the following answer, source 12, our last source of the shir. He quotes the Torah that Moses asked only to travel 3 days' journey. Quotes the Torah, starting here. Zot haita itza amuka Elohit. Moses is following an extremely deep piece of divine advice. Laharot lakol, to show everybody, chozek libo, how hard-hearted, the koshi arpo, and how stubborn Paro was. Hayadu elav asher elav yitztaku mishpatei Hashem yisparach umakutav ne'emanim asher yishaleach bo. That he would not grant anything, even though he knew that God was going to send his makot, uba amo, and to his nation, that he was going to hurt him and his nation with Makot. Pharaoh was warned. He knew it was going to happen, but he was so stubborn, he didn't do anything about it. And that's why Moses says such a minimal ask, that he just wants to go and sacrifice to their God. And afterwards, it would be understood that they would return. Nonetheless, he didn't answer. And all the more so if he says to send them definitively. So again, we have the Leead Yitzchak making a point that what God cares about is what other people think. It's about the image, it's about the vision. But the Leead Yitzchak doesn't say it's about the global stage. It's not about proving to the other nations, proving to the world, nothing like that. He just says it's about showing how hard-headed Pharaoh is. I want to suggest, based on the Leead Yitzchak, that what we have here is actually a fascinating scene of internal politics, of domestic politics, of political intrigue. That on the one hand, we could adopt the Barbanel approach. And what Pharaoh is doing, what God is doing, is orchestrating, pulling the strings behind this negotiation for the global audience. But I think what we could really appreciate what's going on here is that what God is doing is pulling the strings for the Egyptian audience. And what I mean by that is that Pharaoh is a pretty popular leader. He just subjected the rich 1% Jews who Yosef gave a beautiful piece of farmland in Goshen, made them slaves, and he's helping out the people. Everybody's on board, and Pharaoh's power comes from the fact his followers love him. If Pharaoh all of a sudden says, hey, by the way, guys, all your slave labor is gone, there's going to be a revolt. No one's going to be like, oh, okay, well, Pharaoh said it, and he's the god. They're going to lose a huge part of their economy. There's going to be, as unfortunately we all know too really, a civil war. It's going to be a huge issue if Pharaoh just lets everybody go. So I think what's going on here is that God is giving Pharaoh the opportunity to negotiate. And God is giving Pharaoh the opportunity to take a stance and to flex for his constituents. Moshe comes and says, oh, please, Pharaoh, won't you give the Jews a little bit of freedom? And Pharaoh says, no freedom ever, not even 3 days to sacrifice. And then what do you know? It's so harsh that God has to come and do something even more dramatic to force Pharaoh's hand. In other words, Pharaoh the leader, while he is evil and corrupt and oppressive, is also being controlled by the masses who are benefiting from slave labor, who are benefiting from the oppression of the Jews. And what we see here is this careful balancing act that God and Moshe, as wise diplomats, as thoughtful people trying to really accomplish a goal, are trying to balance for Pharaoh's sake. And I think all of that is pulled together at the end of our section where we noted the peculiarity of the Avdei Pharaoh, the servants of Pharaoh. Because now, given what we just said, if we take this perspective that this whole thing, this whole negotiation is just the stage, it's just the show to get the nation on board, to get popular interest on board with freeing the Jews, now we understand. All of a sudden, Moshe appears and says there's going to be locusts that are really bad. And what does he say? Verse 6, they're going to fill your house. Ubatei kol avadecha, all of your servants' house. Ubatei kol Mitzrayim, all of Egypt's house. Because Pharaoh is such a huge lover of the Egyptians, such a benevolent leader, that it's not enough that it's going to affect him. No, it would have been fine. All Moses has to say is it's going to hurt you. That's obviously all Pharaoh cares about. But the point here is that Moses is putting on a show. Moses goes to the public court, and he points to everybody in the public court. He says, you and you and you, you're going to get arbe, you're going to get locust. Your lives are going to be disturbed. You're going to be impoverished. You'll lose loved ones. He's scaring the royal court, scaring the Egyptian populace, so that Pharaoh has the opportunity to let the Jews go. And what we have here is a little insight into the political theater. So then Avdei Pharaoh, the servants of Pharaoh, pick up on Moses' political theater, and they say, how long are you going to do this to us? Let the Jews go. So then Pharaoh says, all right, if you guys want the Jews to go, I'll let the Jews go for a couple of days. So Pharaoh goes and says, you know what, you guys can go celebrate. Moses says, well, actually, we need even our babies. And then Pharaoh can come to the Egyptians and say, look, see, I defended you guys. They were trying to pull a fast one on us. They were trying to run away and never come back. And I, your honest leader, caught them and told them no. Pharaoh's given plausible deniability. He's given a stage to sell his people, to keep his position of leadership. All the while, the diplomatic negotiations between God and Pharaoh, as conducted through Moses, they continue. They keep going back and forth. The plagues keep going back and forth. God's various agendas on the global stage, on the Egyptian stage, for the Jewish children in the future, they all get fulfilled. But what we see here is a very apt insight, a very apt perspective of political intrigue, of how a leader who is in a very difficult situation can balance doing what's best for the nation, what's best for himself, and what's best for public opinion. So I think that's a fascinating perspective. I'd love to hear, I actually don't have so much time, so I would love to hear in follow-up emails, calls, texts, what people think. But just something to throw out there, that maybe the whole point here is not a deception to Pharaoh, but a deception of political theater towards the Egyptian people. So we saw a few approaches to this perhaps troubling question. How could God and Moses deceive Pharaoh? How could they be dishonest? We saw apologetics that they weren't dishonest. We saw somewhere in between that maybe they're dishonest, but it's for a greater cause. And then finally, we saw an approach first put forth a little by the Barbanel and Isaac Arama, and then my slight modification that they were intentionally dishonest as an act of political theater. So thank you everybody for joining us for learning. I look forward to learning together again